Right, in this video, I'm going to share some advice and examples of introductions for a research paper. So as our textbook author, Bruce Ballinger, notes, writing an introduction or getting started in your essay can be the hardest part. It often feels like once you get the introduction done, the rest of the paper comes a lot more easily. The reason for that is because when we are staring at a blank page, there are so many options or ways to start. It can be hard to know how to start, right? So for example, ways that we might start a paper include starting with an anecdote or a short story related to our topic, describing a scene, um, that kind of leads us toward the topic. We could begin with a profile of a specific person who is interesting in relation to what we've researched. Like for example, maybe if you're writing paper on like traumatic brain injury, you might start with a profile of a football player who's had several concussions or had a head injury, right? Um, we can start with general background information. That's probably a very familiar way for you to start a paper where we provide kind of broad knowledge and then slowly narrow our focus of like background knowledge, leading toward a thesis. We can start with an interesting quotation. That's another popular way to start a paper. We can start with dialogue. This would imply like maybe you recount a conversation that you've had with someone else that kind of inspired you to look into the topic more. We can start with a question. This is actually how I started my master's thesis. I started with a question that had kind of been guiding my inquiry throughout the process. So I thought it would be appropriate to share that question with my readers to get started. We can start by building contrast. This is particularly effective if we're evaluating like two different solutions or strategies to a problem. We might talk about the contrast between those things. We can also start by simply announcing our focus. That can be particularly effective if you have a very complicated topic or you just want to get to the point right away. We can just announce what we're discussing. So how do you choose from among these different strategies for starting a paper? One good way to make that decision would be to try a few different options out, which is what the discussion post for this week asks you to do. So to give you a few examples of different ways that you might start a research paper, I decided to write 3 different introductions for a paper on problem-based learning in education. So my trend is problem-based learning, and my goal in the paper is to evaluate whether teachers should adopt that practice sometimes, all the time. Do I want to recommend this strategy to my coworkers? So that's kind of the question that I'm thinking about. And here in my first example, I decide to start with an anecdote or a short story that kind of highlights the main point that I'm interested in researching. And then I kind of narrow that focus to kind of share, not necessarily explicitly, but share what my research focus is going to be. All right, we were playing a game I like to call Murder, She Wrote. I give my students a cartoon image of a murder scene and ask them to work in groups to construct a narrative of what happened, complete with supporting evidence or details visible in the image. The point is to illustrate the need for evidence when making an argument. It's always lively, but in this class, the activity had taken on a life of its own. The students had independently begun drafting arguments and preparing formal presentations to share with the class. This made me reflect on the trend of problem-based learning. Students are given carefully crafted guiding questions, and then in theory, learning takes many shapes and is student-directed. Maybe there is something to the idea of problem-based learning. If it can generate the excitement my silly game did, it may be worth trying. So you can see, again, I kind of start with an anecdote or a short story from my past experience that kind of leads me to my research focus. And then I share that focus with my readers. I'm going to learn about problem-based learning to decide if it's worth trying in a more formal way. All right, here is another example. This one is also a bit of like scene setting, but I wanted to focus on the contrast between problem-based learning and a traditional lecture classroom in order to emphasize why my research topic is interesting. Right? So in this case, I wrote, in the classroom I observed, students were spread out, some sitting on the floor with laptops, others grouped around a desk in conversation, others drawing diagrams on a whiteboard. They all had the same guiding question in front of them, but were approaching it in different ways that fit their learning styles and personalities. This teaching style is called problem-based learning and contrasts sharply with traditional lecture classrooms where the teacher identifies what information is to be learned and shares it with the class via oral explanation. In both cases, the teacher can't really control what the students learn. In a lecture class, students may not be paying attention, for example. But I'm curious which approach is more likely to produce relevant learning for most students. So again, in this case, I kind of try to highlight the differences between two potential approaches to teaching in the classroom, and then I slowly narrow my focus to let readers know that I'm going to evaluate these approaches and then reach a conclusion or make a recommendation. All right, and here's my last example. It's both starting with a quotation and starting with a question. And I return to this question often in reality. So I wrote, in Composition Quarterly, Nancy Miller asked, how can we best help students become the writers we want them to be? As a writing teacher, this is a question I reflect on often as I prepare lessons or consider what went well in class. The question becomes even more pertinent when trying to make sense of potentially faddish trends in educational theory. Like gamification, grading contracts, no homework, themes, or problem-based learning. In this paper, I'd like to learn more about the applications of problem-based learning in writing classrooms, as well as the benefits and drawbacks of this non-traditional approach to teaching. So in this case, again, I kind of start with a question that I think is interesting. In this case, it's also a quotation. And it's, kind of my motivating interest. So I thought it'd be appropriate to share it with my readers as a way into my paper. All right, so those are my examples. My next step in the writing process might be to look over them and decide which one I like best. I might also end up combining one or two of those introductions in order to make it more substantial, or just if I think it fits with what I want to say better, right? So what I'm going to challenge you to do in our current discussion prompt is try out writing 3 different introductions for your own paper. You don't have to spend a lot of time on each option. This is just a first draft, and we're trying to figure out what would be the best way in, right? It's easier to figure out the best way into your paper if we actually try a few different options out rather than just stare at a blank screen and wonder what to say and wonder what to say some more. Right? So this will give us something to work with and a way to move through the writing process. So just again, some strategies you might try for your different introductions include starting with an anecdote, a scene, a profile, background, quotation, dialogue, question, contrast, or announcement, like announcing your focus. Right, I look forward to seeing what you come up with.